Ari, for all that you do. You have taken Orange County and made it a center of Jewish learning, both nationally and even internationally, with the work that you do on all our behalf. I will add all the more that Ari does this as Ari's hobby, his contribution to Jewish life, and again, much gratitude for enriching our lives. I am so delighted to be with David Lang whenever I'm with David Lang. And in this case, I am delighted to share David with my community and with our family. And in that regard, I want to shout out to David's cousin, Cindy Rovi in Cincinnati, Ohio, who has her birthday today. And I will add, I come to David through my wife, Linda, and this is our 34th anniversary week, which means, David, I've known you now a pretty long time. And it's, again, always a treat to be with you. The context for this conversation is focused on Psalm 101 and a musical composition that David composed with a libretto that emerges from Psalm 101 called If I Sing. And that was performed at Lincoln Center about 4 years ago. And when I saw that David had composed this piece after Psalm 101, I thought I wanted to learn more about why you had written it, David. So I read some of those interviews in the Jewish Forward, the review on the series that was held at Lincoln Center. So before, what I'd like to do with the time that we have together is first get a little bit oriented with your love of Psalms, and I will then teach my translation of Psalm 101 to convey a taste of what I've been doing in my classes that Ari Katz mentioned, looking at the poetry of that psalm, and then have you read for us the libretto you composed after it. We'll talk a little bit about it. We'll then hear your composition and then talk about the process of writing that piece. So David is, to extend Ari's introduction, an eclectic soul with great curiosities in many ways that he harvests in his compositions musically. And in his music, he's also both diverse and prolific. I shared with David that I heard him interviewed at the Walt Disney Center before one of his pieces was performed in recent years. And the interviewer said to him, "How is it that you're so diverse? Operas, film scores, choral pieces." And you explained that you learned how to be efficient from watching waiters, that no matter which direction they were walking, they were carrying dishes. And so whenever I carry dishes, I mentioned to you, David, I think of that, and I aspire to be as prolific. With that, David, give us context for your own reading and love of Psalms.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. And I've sat in, as you know, on a number of your teachings on the Psalms, and I've really appreciated it. I can also say it's very handy to have a rabbi in the family. So it's I'm happy that you married my cousin. You know, I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm a majorly religious person, and I wouldn't say that I'm a particularly studied person. So I was very happy to go in a little deeper with you on the Psalms, but I am always very curious about where our religion came from and what our relationship to it should be, and especially as a musician, you know, you end up finding your way to the Psalms very quickly because they are so musical, because music is referenced in them, they're meant to be sung, but also for this other reason, which is that the Psalms seem like they're kind of unique in our religious writings, in that they're a direct conversation between who we are and who we think God is. So that there's a way in which, sort of it's sort of like a catalog of conversations that you might be able to have with God, right? They're all there, right? You're miserable, here's this song. Like, I think if you actually go to the Chabad site, they tell you, okay, if this is what you're feeling, check out this song. It's a list of things that you should do. So I'm very curious about my relationship to my religion. And I think music is a great place to examine it. And so for me, I've used the Psalms as a way to figure out a little better for myself how I feel about where I come from.
So how did it come about, this opportunity to write this composition for performance at Lincoln Center on a psalm? And how did you choose which psalm?
Yeah, this wonderful chorus in Holland, the Netherlands Chamber Choir, had this idea that they were going to do a multi-year project where they would perform every single psalm, a musical setting of every single psalm. So many of these, of course, have been set to music for 1,000 years. So some of them are already staples. Some of the settings are already staples in Western music history, Western classical music. And the ones that, there were gaps where they didn't have ones that they liked, and they decided they're going to commission new music for the ones that they didn't have. So it was this incredibly eclectic show of old and new music. They offered me a bunch of different ones I could pick. So I went through the ones which were available, and I picked this one, and I picked this one for a very specific reason, because I always feel like the conversation that's going on in this one is more like the conversation I could imagine I would be having should I ever have this kind of conversation with God, which is, this one seems very lawyerly to me. This one seems like a negotiation, like it's kind of like a contract. It's like, and I know this is partly based on a translation problem, as was mentioned. It's like Robert Alter mentions, and I'm sure you're going to mention this in your translation also, that there are ways that these things mean different things. But one of the ways that it is translated seems like it is saying, God, if this is how I feel, if I do these things, if I stay away from all this bad stuff, will you show yourself to me? And on the one hand, that's very beautiful because it's calling us to a higher standard of how we are acting. But it also seemed to me like that was like the flip side of that is a kind of negotiation. Like, I'm holding up my end of the bargain. When are you going to hold up yours?
That's great. And that's a great introduction to the psalm. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to put up Psalm 101. I'll read my translation and talk about some of those choices that you just nodded to in terms of different kinds of interpretations. And then I'll put up your libretto, have you read it, talk about some of your choices, and then we'll hear your composition. So let's begin. This will be about a 15 minutes for me to give my sampling of demonstrating the poetry of a psalm, how there are artistic poetic devices used in order to stitch the psalm together, and some of those ambiguities, which is again the nature of poetry, double entendres. With that, a psalm for David. And I smiled knowing that David Lang is the counterpart today. And to think about, David Lang, I'm speaking now, think about the power of being a composer of music and poetry and how a name can endure across time. So this psalm I chose to entitle From the Phrase, that is at the center of David's libretto, which is, Will You Come to Me? Psalm 101. For David, a psalm. Kindness and justice I will sing. To you, Adonai, I will psalm. I will wisely engage with a way of integrity. When will you come to me? I will walk with the integrity of my heart within my house. I will not set before my eyes anything contemptible. The doing of crookedness I have hated. May it not cling to me. May a heart of perversity depart from me. Evil I will not know. One who slanders in secret a neighbor, such I will cut down. Who is haughty of eye or greedy of heart, such I will not tolerate. My eyes are on the trustworthy of the land to sit with me. One who walks in a way of integrity, such will serve me. None will sit within my house who engage in deceit. A speaker of lies will not stay before my eyes. Each morning, I will cut down all the wicked of the land, to cut off from the city of Adonai all the workers of iniquity. So now some teaching on the weave of the psalm. God's name here appears as Yud-He Vav-He, YHWH, and it's the envelope, the frame of this psalm. It only appears twice, the name of God. It's in the opening verse and in the closing verse. 4 lines from the end and few lines from the end of a couple lines toward in verse 1, which is to say, this psalm is both deeply personal, and as you acknowledge, David, what's distinctive about psalms is they are conversations with God. And as conversations with God, they are a range of topics and moods. This particular Psalm 101 is deeply personal. Over and over, the word I, me, my appears. It is the psalmist speaking to God. When it says for David, we don't necessarily know that it is written by King David. Of the 150 Psalms, 48 are identified with King David specifically. There are 10 different people whose names are attributed, but many of the Psalms are for David, either honoring or in synergy or identification with him. We know this person is of some means because we read here of this person having servants, somebody to serve me. So he's clearly somebody with means, but we don't know who the author is. Construction. This is composed of 2 parts, 1 to 4 and 5 to 8. Verses 1 to 4 are about himself in relationship to God. I will wisely engage. I will not set before my eyes. May a heart of perversity depart from me. Verses 5 to 8 are about relationships. They are about his neighbors. They are about the people who come into his home. And so that's where the psalm is divided. Part 1, verses 1 to 4 is the I. Verses 5 to 8 are about relationship. There's a dimension of the we. Likewise, there are 4 different phrases that appear in the first part that will reappear in the second part. In verse 2, the second and third words, b'derech tamim, which means in the way of integrity or in the way of perfection, the way of simpleness, appears again in verse 6, b'derech tamim. Only those who walk in that way of integrity, they're the only ones who I will have sitting with me. The second phrase is the word walking itself. Here in verse 2, reappearing again in that second half in verse 6. Third phrase in verse 2 is the last 2 words, who are within my house, b'kerev beiti. That same phrase appears in verse 7. None will sit within my house. And last, which is the nature of poetry, a rare word in verse 3, setim, which Robert Alter points out is a rare word. Here is the doing of crookedness. And I'll add, since we're looking at verse 3, may it not cling to me, implies that he's had experience with crookedness and he wants to divest himself of the past. Hence, here's one other thing to know about the poetry. In Hebrew, there's only two tenses, perfect and imperfect. Perfect is past and present. Imperfect is present, future, and jussive, meaning let it be. Most translations, most of the verbs are in the imperfect in Hebrew, and I, as most translators, choose to translate it into the future. I will sing, I will psalm, because in the Hebrew grammar, it could be either to show a longing. Last couple comments, and then David's libretto. And that is just staying focused now on this key verse, verse 2, and then one word at the end. I will wisely engage with a way of integrity. That's the first part. And now in Hebrew, Matai tavo Elie. I chose, as did David, to translate, when will you come to me? But in Hebrew, it's a pronoun and it could be it. So it could be you, when will you come to me? Or when will it come to me? And what's the it? The it is 2a, namely the wisdom of engaging, of how to walk the way of integrity. Or it can be, when will you come to me? When will it come to me? Can refer to verse 1 instead of 2a. And the commentators are split on this. So a contemporary in Long Island, Rabbi Martin Cohen, has a book on Psalms I admire. He translates it as you. Most of the medieval Jewish commentators translate it as when will it come to me, referring to the wisdom of how to engage in the path, meaning 2a instead of verse 1. And I'm going to let David explain why he chose to go with that interpretation. And what I love about this opportunity to be with David Lang is the goal of us reading Psalms is personalizing them. It's valuable to be able to pull apart the poetry and to appreciate the artistry of the psalmist. But at the end of the process, the goal is, how do these words apply to us? How are they relevant in our lives? Here's two last comments. 2b, what follows, when will you come to me? I will walk with the integrity of my heart within my house. And I like the commentaries on this that go in two different directions. Some say, what is that referring to? It is even when nobody is watching me, meaning I'm in my home, even when no one's watching, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to act with integrity. So that's one way it gets interpreted, as a test of integrity. What do you do when nobody's watching? And the second way is that what this psalmist is longing for is the immediacy of God's presence. That'll segue to David's bargain. This is a religious psalm in which the psalmist is longing for the experience of encounter with God. And there are those who say that the mindset of being alone creates the quality of contemplation and even altered states that the prophets relied on to encounter God. And so that's the other way to understand, I will walk with the integrity of my heart within my house. May, when I'm alone, may I gain that quality of presence to experience your presence. And with that, just a little comment on the closing line. For another rare word in Hebrew, Labkarim, the first word of verse 8, each morning. It's boker, morning, but in the plural. And the rabbis understand that to say, how does one achieve the experience of God? It's through constancy of practice. And Ibn Ezra, one of the great Bible commentators, will say that through the practice of seeking God, it will become as God will become as accessible as a musician playing a melody on a harp, that the strings will allow the melody to emerge. So will the mindset that's a product of the discipline of labkarim, of regularity, to access God's presence. With that, there's a lot more to be said about the artistry of the psalm, but I want to bring David back to the screen. David, first, any comments before we post your libretto about you looking at Psalm 101 together?
First of all, I love that, and I have so many things to say. The first thing that I have to say is, because there are interpretive differences through history, that oddly enough opens up these psalms to become more personal, because in a way to read them means you have to decide which of these versions of them is more important to you. When I read through all the different translations, of course, Robert Alter, spells it out very clearly, the difference between the two. The Chabad version says one. The King James version says, "When will you come to me?" It opens the door for us to be able to say which of those avenues towards meaning is more valuable to me personally. There's so many things that you said that are so important to the way I set the piece also, because the idea of when it says all the things that he's trying to avoid, that he's had experience with hate, he's had experience with lies, he's had experience with the problems of the world. These are not things that he's theorized. He needs help to keep them away. And the other thing that also got into my translation is when you talk about every morning, the way I interpreted that in my version was, this is not one thing where you're going to solve this problem once. This is not one decision that you're going to have that you're going to make this decision and it's going to make everything easy and you're going to be in the presence of God forever. This is a fight you're going to have every single day. It's hard to keep these things away from you. It's hard to keep the liars away. It's hard to keep God in your view. And so to me, that's the way I interpreted it.
That's beautiful. And I just want to underscore what draws me into Psalms, what you've pointed to, which is that they beckon us to personalize, in part by the need to fill in the blanks of interpretation. And with that, I'm going to put up your libretto and invite you to read it to us.
Okay. So this is the text, and again, it's like I really just wanted to keep the "Will you come to me?" to keep that asking to be in God's presence in the foreground. If I sing of mercy, if I sing of justice, if I sing your praises, will you come to me? If I am true, if I am pure, if I know no evil things, will you come to me? If I'm not proud of eye or heart, will you come to me? I see the faithful. I try so hard to follow them. I see the liars. I try so hard to push them all away. Every day I fight this fight to push the bad away. Will you come to me? Come to me.
Now, in writing this libretto, tell us a little bit about the process of writing the libretto and some of the choices you had to wrestle with.
Well, I love that most, as you pointed out, also one of the reasons why I chose this is because the I is so important. And because as a composer, I feel like what I do is I spend most of my life sitting in my studio thinking about myself, right? That's really what composers do. you're writing music to try to make yourself feel something. So you're very aware of who you are and what you're trying to feel. So I like the fact that this was had a present I, a present first person. And so one of the things I kept doing was all those places where you say the second half of the poem is about the things that are external. I really wanted to turn them back to how I am feeling about that external world, or how the psalmist is feeling about that external world. So converting everything so that it's all on that kind of the difference between who I am and what I want.
I like its conciseness and its sense of longing that comes through. You also, in the beginning of our conversation, described it as bargaining. So talk a little bit about how you see the psalm and your libretto, and what the goal is, if you will, of the psalmist, or in this case, the libretto writer.
Well, I do think that there's we pride ourselves on honoring the idea of wrestling with God, that there's something about our relationship which is not strictly we follow orders. And so for me, one of the things that I really like is trying to find places where we are being upfront about what we get out of the relationship. If you read Lamentations, it's really clear all the terrible things that are going to happen to you, right? This is a little different. This I think is saying, what are the things that we stand up for? We sing, we're for mercy, we're for justice, we're for praises. And what do we need to do in order to get rid of that? We need to get rid of the liars. We need to get rid of the people who speak deceitfully. So we are sort of trying to set up a worldview about what's, how the world is divided, and our ability to get to God has to do with how we live up to our division. So to me, this seems very lawyerly. It seems very. I'm not a lawyer, of course, but this seems very much like it's us trying to say this is a contract. It's like if we are God's people, this is what we have to do on our side of the contract. Okay, God, what's on your side?
And what is on God's side?
Well, I don't know. I haven't finished your course yet.
Well, it's to come. The punchline of the Psalms is the experience of God's presence. And clearly that's conveyed. But you know what else you have embedded here? And I don't know, David, if it was intentional, but there are no coincidences. By my count, Psalms is very invested in counting. So like 7 times a word gets repeated, that's purposeful in Psalms. And 7 is a purposeful number of wholeness, as is the number of 10. And in your libretto, if I count correctly, you have the word if 7 times and the word I 10 times. The 2 numbers of wholeness within our tradition. So whether intentional or not, it's no coincidence. And with that, let's listen to your composition. But before we hear it, and Ari, I'm going to have you help me with that, because I want to make sure that your sound quality might be better than mine. You're sitting with this libretto. Back to process, which came first, the libretto or the music?
I always, when I am writing the text, I always work on the text first before the music. I have to know exactly what the text is doing. And then I feel like when I'm arranging the text, in the back of my mind, I'm also arranging how long things last, how things relate to each other, how tunes work. Then by the time I write the music, I end up knowing a lot of things about the structure of the piece before I choose a single note.
Now, did they tell you how long they wanted the piece to be?
Yeah, I think it was under 10 minutes or something. Mine is only 3 minutes. But some people were much longer than me.
And what's your process? So here you have the libretto. What do you do next?
I read it a million times and I drink a lot of coffee, and then I start singing it to myself, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I sing it.
You sing it to yourself and you
Yeah.
see what emerges.
Yeah.
You sing the words.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a great segue. For Ari, can you help with posting it, or would you like? I'm going to mute myself.
Well, you muted yourself already. So, okay.
Yeah.
You want me to try play the song?
Would you want me to do it?
Yeah, why don't you try since you have it, and if it doesn't work, I'll be your backup.
Okay. Here we go. 1 second.
Don't forget to mute yourself when the song starts.
And you also have to enable the sound, okay,
right.
Got it.
All right, here we'll see.
We can't hear it. No. You must maybe just start again, unmute yourself. And then just don't start again, but don't move your key once you start it, because every time you move your key, you stop the recording.
All right. So 1 second. My problem will be going back to the beginning. So let's see here what I can do. This is where I am technologically challenged. So two things to mention is on that album that I was just showing on Spotify is another one of David's compositions, which is a composition based on another psalm, Before One Goes to Sleep at Night. David, you've hummed the words. How did you go from humming the words to what we just heard? Fill us in. You have to unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah, you know, I try to honor the things from the original text, you know, so the two parts, if you hear it, like if you go to Spotify, you can hear this piece a little better, and then you can hear it over and over again and maybe get the shape of it. But you'll see that the place where he looks outside of himself, where the psalmist is looking to the thing around him, that the music changes at that moment. So it's just trying to, you go back and forth between trying to sing something that sounds nice and also to try to do something that makes the meaning of the text clearer. So I find like when I write these texts, or when I write this music, I'm the official reader of the text.
Yeah. What was the first time you heard what we just heard? Meaning, what's the first time you heard it performed?
I went to a rehearsal at Lincoln Center the morning of the premiere. That was it. I didn't. That was when I heard it. So. And
do you remember your reaction hearing it for the first time?
Yeah, I thought they should sing louder and faster. So.
And did they in the evening?
Yeah, they sang louder and faster, but you know, you can always sing louder, you know. So it's always weird, you know, because I feel like when you write the music, it's like knowing the plot of a movie that you've seen in black and white on television, as opposed to seeing it in a movie theater in color, you know, on a giant screen. When you see something live, you know the plot, you know everything that's happening, you know all the you know what's gonna take place, but you know the magnification of it is really fantastic. That's kind of the thrill.
And so I assume you were sitting that night back at Lincoln Center hearing it performed, but now obviously if it was me, you're like wanting to see how people are going to react around you. How does it feel to be listening to others around you listening?
Yeah, I don't know. It's always weird. It's always weird. To me, the best part of music for me is the rehearsal. So that's the place where you work with the musicians, where you figure out, did I make any mistakes, or what can I change, or how can I explain myself better so that the musicians will understand it and perform it better. And then when it gets to live performance, or when you get to playing your music in public, you know, all that can happen is something that can mess up, or you can be nervous about it or something, you know. Rehearsal is really where the fun is.
So we're going to segue in a moment to the questions for other people to weigh in and ask some questions. But, well, why don't we do that? Here's what I was going to say, and I'll just bring it to everybody's attention. And that is, as I noted, you are diverse in the nature of your compositions, from operas to these short pieces to longer pieces, and choral versus just music. And your best known composition, by virtue of having received the Pulitzer for it, was A Little Match Girl Requiem. And I love the story of your need to write, if you will, a requiem that didn't deal with a Christian point of view. Just say a word about that.
Well, it's something that's, you know, on your mind all the time when you are a classical musician and you're not a Christian, is that so much of the history of Western classical music deals about composers trying to figure out better ways to worship Jesus. And so I'm always been interested in choral music. When I was in college, I sang in a Gregorian chant choir in a Catholic church. You know, that music is amazing, right? It's fantastic. But there are moments where it gets uncomfortable. Bach, who is the greatest composer ever to many of us, in the St. John Passion, there's no way to say it. It's not good for the Jews, right? So how do you deal with this? Normally what happens is you write pieces as a Jewish composer or a non-Christian composer, you write pieces that avoid the topic. So for that piece, The Little Match Girl Passion, I decided I didn't want to avoid it anymore. I wanted to figure out, can I think of what's the universal story in the passion story, in the Christian passion story? And can I tell that story by taking Jesus out? Because the story of the passions, which is a big part of Western music history, is being able to set music to go along with the passion story, is, looking at Jesus's suffering and going, if we notice that suffering, we would be better people. And I just wondered, well, why does it have to be noticing Jesus's suffering? Maybe we could notice somebody else's suffering. Maybe noticing anybody's suffering makes it into a religious experience. So I took parts of the Bach St. Matthew Passion, where the crowd is watching the suffering of Jesus, and I took the Jesus story out, and I put the Little Match Girl story in the first translation into English from the 1840s, and that was it. So when I won the Pulitzer, there was a big, one of those banners on Fox News that said, "Composer wins Pulitzer for taking Jesus out of the Gospels."
I will add that Linda and I went to hear it performed live in Los Angeles at a church, and it was stirring. And even, so it's fascinating. And last comment, and then we'll take some questions, is what's distinctive about the Psalms, our topic of today, is that they are both Christian and Jewish, and a shared, if you will, liturgy that unites us. So let me hear some of the voices. It's so wonderful to have so many listeners. I will add, Bonnie Lee wrote, in listening to the If I Sing, sublime, closing my eyes, can imagine being in court of King David. That's high praise.
That's nice.
So let me facilitate a few questions that I've seen, if that's okay.
Yes, please do, Ari.
The number one, so David, aside from your piece on Psalms, which composition do you like the most? Do you have a favorite that you recommend that we all listen to?
A favorite of any kind, or what?
Yeah, within the context of Psalms, someone who's put Psalms to music, written a composition, a musical piece that you recommend.
I think one of the greatest pieces that is a Psalm piece is the piece by Steve Reich that's just called Tehillim. And it's 4 Psalms with his ensemble. It's an incredibly beautiful and really fun and really kind of magical piece of music. So Steve Reich, Tehillim.
And another quick question is, how does this piece compare with your other pieces that you've written? Is this, did you get inspiration from something else that you've written, from something else you heard? How did you come up with this particular, the composition, the music? Where did it come from?
I have no idea. I have no idea where these things come from. I really think they come out of the text. I really think, like a lot of the times, as Elie mentioned, I write pieces that don't have words. And then you have to do something that's incredibly abstract. You can think about things that are fun for instruments to do, and then you do them, and that leads you different places. When I work with words, I really just try to be as honest to the words as possible. I really try to look at them, read them, shape them so they're meaningful to me, and then somehow the music miraculously emerges that tells the meaning of those words as honestly as I can.
Thank you.
I know you, Leonard Bernstein did the Chichester Psalms.
Right.
I don't know them very well. What would you want to share with us if you do know them?
Well, I'm trying to think of other Psalms. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, like Bach has all these beautiful Psalm settings that are, they're just fantastic. If you go through, like all of music history, I think that's one of the interesting things, it's something that people don't think of, is that, most people in Western classical music did their music on commission, right? So most people, we think that composers are just doing things that are emotional, but most of this music was commissioned. People asked for it, they paid for it. That's how composers have always made a living. And because the number one employer for most of Western music history has been the church, there's a lot of really great religious music. So one of my favorite composers is this composer Arvo Pärt, who's his last name is P-A with an umlaut R-T, who's an Estonian composer whose music has a huge amount of religious music, which is unbelievably beautiful and heartfelt, and he's still writing music right now. And it's I think that anyone who wants to study Western music ends up dealing with this, kind of history of liturgical music in some way.
Yeah. Ari, do you have another question?
Yeah, given that we talked about this before, and Rabbi Spitz has mentioned this a few times to me, my family history is 100% Lithuanian, and apparently you are the official composer of the country of Lithuania. So you want to talk a little bit about that and what that means, and about your visits to Lithuania and what you've learned?
I'm not the official composer, but I've been 3 or 4 times, and I've been very vocal about how my grandparents both came from little shtetls in Lithuania. And I think the first time I went there, I had to do a public conversation, and somebody asked me something, and so I said, okay, well, to my mind, the greatest writer from Lithuania was the writer Chaim Grada. So does anyone know him? And none of these people knew, because of course, it's like the teaching of the Jewish history of Lithuania is very spotty. And so I said, if you really want to know what it was like when the Germans came in to, Vilnius, you can find this in the works of Chaim Grada. So you should really read it. So after that moment, I think a lot of people there decided that that they would like to have me come back, because I was so open about saying that I was happy to be there. And so the last time I went to the little town Garzde, where Linda Spitz and my grandfather was from, and that was very moving, because there's very little memory there that Jews had been there, but of course it was a Jewish town. And there's a cemetery that's now, like the remains of the Jewish cemetery is out in the middle of a field, and kind of behind the road. And so when you're in the little town, you're in a modern little tiny town. And the minute you step off that road, you're, back in, a field in the mud in shtetl country, and there's this little tiny cemetery. So it's been very moving to go back, and I have plans to go back again. So
did you share your music while you were there? And if so, what music did you share?
Yeah, I actually was the featured composer at the Big Contemporary Music Festival in Lithuania 2 seasons ago, where they did probably 10 pieces of mine or something. I've been back many times. Yeah. So and it's all for music. So I mean, one of the really weird things about it is I don't travel anymore unless it's to a performance. So like traveling for pleasure sounds really I mean, at this moment, because of COVID, traveling anywhere would be really fun. But it used to be the traveling for pleasure was something like, if I didn't have to go someplace, I'd rather just stay home and read the paper, but that was a holiday to me. But because most of the life of a professional musician is on the road.
What are you working on right now? Are you working any, what kind of pieces?
Yeah, I have a bunch of things going on right now. So, and actually, I do lots of things that are not religious. So you shouldn't, think of me as being typecast. But I'm doing a big project right now based on texts from the Song of Songs. So.
Tell us about the big thing you've done, crowds of thousands.
Yeah, as I said, I really like rehearsal. So one of the things that I really like is that you get all these great musicians together and you write music for them that's really hard, and they have to work really hard, and they feel like they built this community together. Like you write an opera and everybody's together. It's really intense, and you get this really great feeling when everyone's together. And then I started thinking that feeling of togetherness and of community, it's really a shame that the only way you can share that is with people who are, like the greatest musicians, right? That's something we all need in our lives. And so I started thinking it might be really fun to make these kind of community pieces where ordinary people from the community had to come together and rehearse something really hard. So I did a piece a few years ago for festivals in England and Berlin called Crowd Out, for 1,000 people yelling. And that was really fun. And in fact, this was done at the LA Philharmonic 2 seasons ago. And it was really fun. And I enjoyed it so much that I started looking for more. So I did a piece for 1,000 amateurs at Lincoln Center called The Public Domain, which was very beautiful. I did a piece for 1,000 completely community-based singers who were on the High Line in New York, which is that incredible public park in New York. I did a piece called The Mile Long Opera, where I gave 1,000 individual arias to these singers, and you walk by them as you walk from one end of the High Line to the other. And you can hear this buzz as you are walking by, but you can actually lean in and hear their stories if you want. And then I wrote a piece for all the broken musical instruments in the Philadelphia public school system. So, and this was for amateurs and professional musicians in Philadelphia to get together. And I wrote this piece for all the broken musical instruments. And as part of this, we were able to raise enough money to repair all these broken musical instruments, which was great. So I really like writing music that's really hard. And I really like working together to rehearse this music and make it perfect. And then I just started thinking, amateurs should have this this ability to work really hard too.
Well, I think we're going to pull this together because it's almost 1:30. And I say to the audience, as David is sharing, David is diverse and eclectic and surprising in the things he does. And some you'll perhaps relate to more than others, but all you will feel a creative playfulness, which I think, David, is how I experience you, not only when I listen to your music, but when I'm with you. So a closing word, David, and then I'll do a closing word about trying to get people to listen to my psalm talks.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and I've really enjoyed the psalm talks. I feel like you have painted a picture of me as very wide, but a lot of times to go very wide, you end up being very shallow. So it's been great to have an opportunity with you to become a little more deep.
Well, I'll say that every time you have tuned into my psalms, it clearly brings pressure on me to be my best and to raise my presentations. I have now, this is for the larger audience, 100 psalms of portfolio, now 101 with this conversation. And they're at our website, www.cbi18.org. So today is my celebration of having entered into the last third of Psalms. And I can't think of a happier way for me to have done it than to celebrate it with you, David, with my wife, Linda, and a lot of your cousins, your sister, and with Ari Katz, who has, again, enriched all our lives in so many ways. So thank you to David, named for David, and to Ari.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. And thank you, David, for joining us, and Rabbi Spitz for your work. And yeah, big work. You're going to finish all of Psalms. So you'll look back on COVID and you'll have, something substantive, a lot of challenges, but something substantive to share for future generations and learners. Thank you all, CSP, for being with us. We'll see you tomorrow, maybe. And keep safe, keep vaccinated, get vaccinated. And hopefully now you know David Lang. I actually put a lot of stuff in chat that you can read and listen to. People ask David how they found your music, so they can look up, I guess, your music on Spotify, Amazon. You can buy it. And
I have a website also, so davidlangmusic.com.
So you know what surprised me when I went to Spotify is that when I looked to see how many listeners you had, it was in 7 digits for many of your things. It was really quite delightful to see.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
David?
Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Again, it feels to me like, in our tradition, there's the notion of a siyum, a party that you make when you reach milestones of learning. This is my milestone of entering into the hundreds of Psalms. And this is like a party for me to have shared it with you.
Well, thank you so much, Elie. I always love seeing you, and it's always really, fun. So and it's very flattering to be part of your series. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, best to all the family.
To your family too. Okay. See you all later. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Ari, thank you.